This is Noise from the Cranium. My name is Doug, and in this episode I'm going to spotlight a number of musicians working in rock music who took a hard left turn and ended up in the avant-garde. I was listening to a David Sylvian album the other day and was struck by how odd it was. In fact, he had gone beyond what you would call rock music and was really out there in the ether. I started thinking about other musicians who had success in the rock world and used it as a springboard for some of their loftier ideas. Before I get to that, let's first look at David Sylvian's career in a bit more detail. He got his start in the mid-1970s with the band Japan, initially patterning themselves after the glam stylings of the New York Dolls, T-Rex, and David Bowie. They morphed into more of a Roxy Music type of band, with Sylvian doing his best Bryan Ferry. They had a number of top 40 hits, mainly in the UK, but after they broke up in the early 80s, David Sylvian went on to a prolific solo career, dabbling in pop, jazz fusion, and finally avant-garde. He collaborated with a number of musicians along the way, including Robert Fripp, Holger Zuke from Can, and Bill Nelson from Bebop Deluxe. As time went on, his music became more minimalist and improvisational. In 2009, he released a startling album called Manaphon. Here's a song from that album called The Rabbit Skinner.
Combed his body for disorder, but the disease lived on in far-off quarters.
Sylvian himself admitted that as a young man, he listened to avant-garde classical composer Karlheinz Stockhausen and had been dabbling in the deconstruction of the pop song ever since. It would seem that with Manaphon, he finally got there. Noel Scott Engel came to prominence in the mid-60s with an LA band called the Walker Brothers. The three band members weren't related, but liking how the name sounded, they began using Walker as their last names just to keep the plot going. So Scott Engel became Scott Walker. In an inspired move, they went to England thinking that they would find success there. As fate would have it, that's exactly what happened. They scored a number of hits, including a #1 single in 1966 called The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore.
Loneliness is a cloak you wear, a deep shade of blue is always there. The sun ain't gonna shine anymore, the moon ain't gonna rise in the sky, the tears are always cloudy in your eyes when you're without.
Paralleling the Beatles, they had screaming fans at their concerts, a huge fan club, and lots of exposure in the teen music magazines of the day. Then, as the music scene changed, the band's success waned and musical differences caused a breakup. Scott Walker began releasing solo albums, each one further from the Walker Brothers' style than the last, moving from pop to Baroque pop, Broadway hits, Jacques Brel, and finally to avant-garde. Walker is a great example of an experimental musician continually looking for ways to reinvent himself. He released a trio of experimental albums between 1995 and 2012, always searching for textures and timbres to replicate the sounds he was hearing in his head. Walker explored any and every idea, no matter how bizarre. The song Clara from his 2006 album The Drift shows how far off the beaten track he went. He asked orchestral percussionist Alistair Malloy to add the rhythmic accompaniment to the song by punching a huge side of raw pork. Now that's entertainment.
Stop it, stop it. You're gonna have to give it more like you know what I mean? Like, because if you wait too long between punches, it's not it's too fast, but it's gonna be more varied and like that.
The Drift featured uncomfortable lyrical themes, loud and quiet sections juxtaposed against one another, and bizarre sound effects. It's a deeply unsettling, uncomfortable, and even disturbing listen. Not the best recipe for success. Although I respect Walker for being an innovative and inventive musician who constantly seeks the path to his inner musical satisfaction, some of the extremes he visits are definitely not for the faint of heart. Don Van Vliet had gone to school with Frank Zappa, hanging out as teenagers in the 50s listening to old blues 45s and getting experimental with their music. Zappa nicknamed Don Captain Beefheart for a project they were working on, and it soon became his stage name. Van Vliet's path of musical self-discovery began with the blues. His first album, Safe as Milk, released in 1967 and co-credited to his band, the Magic Band, was steeped in the blues. Beefheart's vocals were highly reminiscent of Howlin' Wolf, and with Ry Cooder on guitar, the album was a stellar debut.
Hey, 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 all you young girls, wherever you're at. I got a brand new Cadillac, got a Ferrari too. Yeah, sure enough, baby, sure enough.
Fast forward a couple of years, and Beefheart was back working with Zappa, continuing their experiments in sound. Zappa had signed on to produce Beefheart's next album, but no one could have imagined at the time that it would become Beefheart's masterpiece. Beefheart and the Magic Band rehearsed the album in a rented house in Woodland Hills for 8 months. When they emerged, it was with an absolute game changer, Trout Mask Replica.
My smile is stuck. I cannot go back to your frown land. My spirit's made up of the ocean and the sky and the sun and the moon and all I can see.
Complete with bizarre musical passages and Beefheart's lyrical landscapes, it is still considered groundbreaking and highly influential today. In 2003, when Rolling Stone compiled their list of 500 greatest albums of all time, Trout Mask Replica was number 58. It was inducted into the American Library of Congress Registry in 2010. Beefheart went on to release a number of great albums in the 70s and early 80s before stepping away from the music business completely and focusing instead on his painting. He became a highly sought-after and successful artist, with his work garnering large sums of money. Tom Waits is another one of those enigmas, marching to his own very specific beat. Signed by Frank Zappa's manager, on his early albums, Waits adopted a beatnik lounge singer persona, seemingly drunk at the piano, slurring as he went. Calculated, not drunk.
The piano has been drinking. My necktie is asleep. And the combo went back to New York. Jukebox been busted for several weeks, 'cause the carpet needs a haircut, and the spotlight looks like a prison break, and the telephone's out of cigarettes, and the balcony is on the make, and the piano has been drinking heavily tonight.
In live performance, the stories he told leading up to the song were as good as the song itself. One of the songs that he wrote and released on his first album was Old 55, a beautiful song later covered by the Eagles.
Well, my time went so quick, I went lickety-split out to my old 55. As I pulled away slowly, feeling so holy, God knows I was feeling alive. And now the sun's coming up, and I'm riding with that love. Freeway cars and trucks, stars beginning to fade as I lead
Many Eagles fans had no idea that Tom Waits had written that song, but it provided him with a decent source of revenue. After a number of albums and a relatively successful career to that point, including 2 tours supporting Frank Zappa, Waits met his future wife Kathleen Brennan in 1980. With Brennan's influence, Waits got rid of his record producer, his manager, and even his musical style. She introduced him to the music of Captain Beefheart, which produced a major change in Waits' music. Abandoning the beatnik jazz of his earlier albums, he dressed his stories of the dark, seamy underbelly of America with a disjointed cacophony of sound. To contrast these artists, I'm going to look at a band who started in the avant-garde and then gained success after moving to a mainstream hard rock style. Vincent Furnier was a singer in an up-and-coming but struggling band called Nas. Furnier, looking for a gimmick to allow the band to break into the music business, came up with the band name Alice Cooper. That seemed to check a number of boxes for him. An all-male band with a female name, a wholesome-sounding name to counteract their bizarre style of music, and once they spread the rumor that Alice was in fact a 17th century witch who had contacted them using a Ouija board, their mythology was in place. Furnier later adopted the stage name Alice Cooper. The band's bizarre stage presence and quirky music caught the attention of Frank Zappa, who signed them to a record deal. Their first album, Pretty's For You, cycled between experimental, psychedelic, and avant-garde. One of the more avant pieces was Levity Ball. It was only after they moved on to Warner Brothers that they found their success as a hard rock band with a theatrical stage show.
Well, we got no choice. All the girls and boys making all that noise, 'cause they found new toys. Well, we can't salute ya, can't find a flag. If that don't suit ya, that's a drag. School's out for summer. School's out forever. School's been blown to pieces.
There have been other rock and pop musicians who have dabbled in the avant-garde to varying degrees of success, including John Lennon and Yoko Ono, George Harrison, Lou Reed, and even Kate Bush. A name that keeps popping up when discussing other artists in this episode is in fact the granddaddy of all avant-garde rock musicians, Frank Zappa. Zappa was an early adopter of the avant-garde, experimenting in sound well before the first Mothers of Invention album was released, and he never stopped experimenting. It would take several shows to fully discuss Zappa's avant-garde works, so I'm simply going to leave you with one of my favorite Zappa avant-garde pieces, taken from his classical release Boulez Conducts Zappa, The Girl in the Magnesium Dress. This has been Noise from the Cranium. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.